Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to a story that will send chills down your spine. This is the story titled The Ghost Behind the Door, a terrifying tale from an old apartment in New York. Don't forget to subscribe because we're about to dive into a real terrifying story full of mystery. In 2005, a young woman named Sarah, who had just moved to New York, was searching for an affordable place to live. After weeks of looking, she finally found an old apartment in the lower Manhattan area. The apartment was on the third floor of an ancient building that had been standing for decades. Sarah felt relieved, even though the building looked a bit worn down. However, the rent was suspiciously cheap for such a strategic location. Sarah was a young professional who had just started her career at a major media company. Although New York was a busy city, it brought new hopes for her. But there was something not quite right about the apartment. On her very first night, Sarah was extremely tired after a long day and fell asleep as soon as she arrived. But something strange began to happen. At 2 a.m., Sarah was awakened by a loud knock on her apartment door. At first, she thought it was a noise from outside, but when she checked, there was no one at the door. She was confused, but eventually went back to sleep. In the following days, the knocking grew more frequent. It wasn't just the knocking. Sarah also noticed that the temperature in the living room would suddenly drop to an eerie chill, even though there was no fan or air conditioner on. This coldness would appear out of nowhere, only at night. Curious and disturbed, Sarah decided to look into the history of the old building. She visited the local library and searched through old archives about the place. It turned out that the building had a dark history. In 1923, a family living on the third floor was found dead in a horrific manner. It was believed that the family was murdered by an unknown man who was thought to be a former resident of the building. Every night, the knocking became louder and more frequent. And not just that, Sarah could also hear whispers coming from behind the door. One night, while sitting in the living room, a faint voice could be heard. From behind the door, the voice sounded like a soft whisper, but it was very clear. "Please, help me." The voice grew louder, and Sarah felt as though someone was standing right outside her apartment door, but no one was there. At this point, Sarah began to feel that something was terribly wrong with the apartment. The knocking grew more intense, and the whispers did not stop disturbing her sleep. What exactly was happening in this old apartment? Who was haunting Sarah? And was this voice coming from a restless spirit, or was there something darker behind all this? As the days went by, Sarah's anxiety grew. The knocking on the door didn't stop. In fact, it became a nightly ritual that she dreaded more and more. Each night, it was as if the presence behind her door grew stronger, more persistent. It was no longer just a knock. Now, she could hear faint scraping sounds, like nails against wood, coming from the other side. Sometimes, she would even hear someone whispering her name in a soft, almost comforting tone. "Sarah," the voice would say, just low enough for her to think it was in her head. At first, she tried to dismiss it as a figment of her imagination. The stress of adjusting to a new city and a new job, coupled with the isolation of living alone, could make anyone paranoid. But the noises didn't stop. They became more tangible, more real, and no amount of explanation could chase the fear away. One evening, after hearing the scraping sound again, Sarah decided to confront whatever it was. She grabbed a flashlight and slowly approached the door, heart pounding in her chest. She was ready to face whatever was making those terrifying noises. But when she opened the door, there was nothing. Just an empty hallway. No one. No sound. Nothing. It was as if the apartment was mocking her fear, pretending to be empty, while something unseen lurked in the darkness. The coldness in the apartment was unbearable. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the eerie chill that settled in the air, the kind of cold that made your skin crawl. Sarah would turn the heat up, but it would still feel like an icebox. She began to feel like she wasn't alone in the apartment. She would catch glimpses of something moving in her peripheral vision, shadows crossing the walls, fleeting and uncatchable. But every time she turned to look, there was nothing there. Just an empty room and her racing heartbeat. One night, she could no longer take it. Sarah was fed up with the knocking, the cold, the whispers, and the growing sense that something, yes, someone, was watching her. She decided to call the landlord, Mr. Johnson, hoping he could offer some explanation. He was an old man, always polite, but a bit too quiet for Sarah's liking. When she called, she could hear the hesitation in his voice. "Sarah, it's an old building," he said, his tone suddenly uneasy. "We've had some strange occurrences in the past. I think it's best if you leave that apartment." "Strange occurrences?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding. "What do you mean? What happened here?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Mr. Johnson finally spoke. "There were rumors of a family that once lived there. A tragedy. But you need to leave, Sarah. The apartment is haunted. It's not safe." His words sent a chill down her spine. Haunted? She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by the landlord was a different matter entirely. She asked him what had happened to the family, but he would only say that the details were too grim to discuss. He told her that the previous tenants had moved out suddenly, one by one, always in a hurry, always leaving their belongings behind. Sarah didn't want to know anymore. She hung up the phone, her thoughts racing. That night, as she lay in bed, the cold returned. The knocking began again, louder this time, followed by the familiar whisper. "Sarah." She tried to ignore it, to block it out, but it was as if the voice was inside her mind, growing louder and more insistent. She couldn't sleep. The darkness in the apartment seemed to close in on her, pressing against her from every side. Then, just when she thought she might go mad from fear, she heard a new sound, a low, guttural growl coming from deep within the walls. It sounded like something or someone was trying to break through. Her heart stopped. She didn't want to believe it, but the sound was unmistakable. Something was alive inside the apartment, something ancient, something evil. She had to leave. But where would she go? The building was all she could afford, and she couldn't return home. She had no family to turn to. She felt trapped, suffocated, and the walls around her seemed to close in with each passing hour. The next morning, Sarah tried to go about her day as usual, but the fear weighed heavily on her. Every time she entered her apartment, she felt the presence, like something or someone was lurking just beyond her sight. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was even worse. It was the kind of silence that screamed at you, making your skin prickle, your ears buzz. She knew she couldn't stay, but she also knew that no matter where she went, the memories of this haunted apartment would follow her. The whispers, the growl, the cold. But there was one thing Sarah didn't know. This was just the beginning. The following week was the hardest Sarah had ever faced. The whispers, the knocks, the growling, they all grew more insistent, more forceful. It was as if the apartment itself was alive, suffocating her with its malevolent presence. Every corner she turned, she felt watched. Every night, She was afraid to sleep because she knew what would happen when the darkness fell. By now, Sarah had tried everything. She consulted mediums, paranormal experts, and even a priest who specialized in exorcisms. But nothing worked. Each person she brought into the apartment claimed they could feel the cold, the heaviness in the air. Some even claimed to have seen dark figures moving in the shadows, but none could offer any real solution. They all said the same thing: "You have to leave." But Sarah had nowhere to go. Her job was demanding, and with the high rent of New York, she couldn't afford to relocate. Every attempt to move out of the apartment was met with dead ends. She was trapped in her own fear. One evening, after a particularly harrowing day at work, Sarah returned home to an apartment that seemed unusually still. The air was thick with tension, and for the first time in weeks, the usual sounds, knocks, whispers, absent. It felt wrong. The silence seemed unnatural, oppressive. She walked cautiously to her bedroom, and there on her bed, she found an old photograph. It was a picture of a family, the same family, she realized, from the history of the building. Their faces were frozen in a black and white moment from the past, their eyes cold and lifeless, yet hauntingly familiar. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. Her breath turned to mist in front of her, and the shadows in the room deepened. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling as she picked up the photo. She felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to run, to escape before it was too late. But as she turned to leave the room, a low guttural growl filled the air. It came from behind her, deep within the walls, as if the entire building was alive. Before she could react, the door slammed shut. Sarah was locked inside. She tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the walls pressing tighter with every passing second. Her breath quickened as the whispers grew louder, now echoing all around her. "Sarah, come closer. We're waiting." Panic flooded her senses. She turned to the window, but the outside world seemed distant, unreachable. The apartment was a prison, and the ghosts inside were its warden. In a desperate attempt, Sarah grabbed the photograph and threw it at the door. She screamed, her voice echoing through the small apartment. But no one could hear her. There was no escape. The building itself seemed to be suffocating her, pulling her deeper into a dark history. And then, as if the very air around her thickened, a cold skeletal hand reached out from the darkness. Sarah's eyes went wide with terror as the hand touched her shoulder. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, but the feeling remained. That was when she saw it. In the corner of the room, the shadows began to take form. A figure, tall and looming, stepped out from the darkness. It was a man, but not a man. His face was distorted, his features warped beyond recognition. His eyes were hollow black voids, and his mouth opened to reveal sharp jagged teeth. It was the man from before. The same figure that had killed the family, the same figure that haunted the apartment for decades. With a horrifying shriek, the figure reached for Sarah, its long fingers stretching out toward her. She backed away, desperate to escape, but the room was too small and the shadows were everywhere. The figure moved closer, its growls growing louder, its form becoming clearer with every step. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure lunged. But instead of feeling the cold grip of death, Sarah felt herself pulled backward. The shadow disappeared, and the room seemed to collapse around her. The air became thick, with almost unbearable silence. Sarah opened her eyes, unsure if she had fainted or if something else had happened. She found herself standing outside the apartment, in the hallway. The door was open. She could see the apartment, empty, silent, as if nothing had ever happened. She had felt the ghosts of the past had been unleashed, and her heart was never willing to let it go. As Sarah turned and walked away, she could feel the weight of the building. The haunting whispers still echoed in her ears, and the growl of a creature, the man from the photo. But the most terrifying thing was the realization that the building wasn't just haunted by ghosts. For Sarah, the horror wasn't over. It had only just begun. As we conclude this terrifying journey through the haunted apartment, we are reminded that some places carry the weight of dark histories that cannot easily be forgotten. Never ignore the signs around you, because sometimes the past can reach out in ways we least expect. If you enjoyed this chilling story and want to hear more spine-tingling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with your thoughts. What do you think happened to Sarah? Do you believe her story? Let us know, and we'll see you in the next one, where the next horror may be closer than you think. Until then, stay safe and always be aware of the shadows that might be lurking behind the door. Thank you for watching.